The ancients referred to sight as the most excellent of the sensory perceptions, and down through the entire history of religion and philosophy, the power and faculty of sight has played a very large part in the development of man's concepts of God and nature. Sight is probably the most important bridge that the individual has between his internal life and the material world around him. And from the beginning, sight has had a certain validity, a certain power, which has extended itself to every phase of life and has been accepted as almost absolute testimony before a court of law. Things seen are difficult to deny. That which we have actually beheld with our own eyes, we affirm and insist to be true. And it is difficult to shake us from any conviction which we can support by visual evidence. Yet from the beginning, man has been suspicious of sight. He has not been quite sure how valid the testimony of the eye should really be considered. Of course, in Eastern philosophy, it has not been regarded as especially valid. But at the same time, it has been universally admitted that things seen must have some kind of existence. They must have shape and form and color. They must also have relationships by proximity or distance. They have mass and body to them. Or else we may perceive motion, not of itself, but through things moved. And gradually, through the use of sight, we develop attitudes, and these attitudes become very important in our daily thinking. If it had not been for sight, for example, we might never have become so desperately fascinated with the material world around us. Sight causes us to give precedence to things seen, regarding them as more real or valuable than things unseen. Here, however, we must pause for a moment, for in the last few centuries in particular, we have come to recognize that the power of sight is comparatively limited. That for one thing that can be seen by the eyes, there must be 100 other things which cannot be seen. Sight, because of its very structure, is restricted and limited to a certain vibratory range. Things seen are innumerable, but the power to see them differs very strongly with individuals. One very simple impediment of sight, which to most persons is not regarded with utter seriousness, is color blindness. The colorblind person lives in a world of color distortions, depending largely upon the degree of his color blindness. If he is defective only in the power to see a particular or certain color, he may have a considerable color range of visibility, but the colors will not be exactly as the normal person sees them. He has a restriction. If he is unable to see the color blue, for example, everything in nature that is blue becomes gray or colorless. If red is the color that is not in his visual spectrum, then red in everything ceases to be red. If, however, it was only this, it might not be so confusing. But this same faculty, by its defect, cuts out red from many other compound color combinations. Therefore, violet becomes blue, orange becomes yellow. Wherever the red factor exists, there is no longer a proper or adequate registration. Now, to the person who is born with this defect, his own color world may seem to be rather normal to him. He grows up in it, he is not aware of anything else, and while perhaps intellectually he can be taught to realize that he has a color deficiency, he cannot actually experience it, because experience again is a matter of contrast. If he had once had the power to see red and lost it, then he would be able to estimate his own deficiency. But if he is born without this power, then to him the universe is the color combination which he can see. We use this merely to point out that even within our so-called normal experiences, there are examples in which we note clearly that the eye is not always trustworthy, and that its actual ability to register properly depends upon its own nature and its own structure and its own energy, rather than upon the form or structure of things seen. There is certain dependency, of course, upon the objective, but there is also a great responsibility upon the subjective power of sight. The sight also is very heavily influenced by attention. The things which we want to see, we see clearly, sometimes to an exaggerated degree. But if our minds are indifferent to a thing, we are not aware of it with any clarity of sight. Also, the sight problem becomes easily confused by mentation. A dozen persons observing an accident will bring in 12 different accounts of that accident, each account in some way psychologically influenced by basic attitudes of the person who sees. Thus we know that sight is highly conditioned by attitude, and that things which appear to be perfectly commonplace and about which there seems to be no visual problem become complicated because of attitude, because of our own intention to disregard, or our failure to be attentive, or a preconception about a thing. Even after the visual registry has been achieved with some accuracy, we are able to mentally and emotionally undermine this evidence until actually we are able to talk ourselves or think ourselves or argue ourselves out of that which we have actually seen. If it were not for the fact that we have certain mental blindness, sometimes combined with perfect visual power, that we are able to have so many diverse and often inconsistent attitudes and opinions about common things. Another problem that we do observe very definitely in connection with sight is its aesthetic factor. Persons of apparently normal sight, looking at a certain object, particularly an object which is regarded as a work of art, will come to a number of different attitudes or conclusions about that object. To some, a particular painting is immediately a thing of beauty. To others, it will never appear attractive. To one person, a certain type of sculptural figure will seem to have magnificent proportion. To another person, there will be no such symmetry. It will seem distorted, strange, and unpleasant. All things being taken together, we know that in art especially, familiarity becomes the basis of much acceptance. We can talk ourselves in and out of the values of the things we see aesthetically. If we belong to a time in which classical art is favored, we will find many beauties in it. But if we live in a time of Impressionism, Cubism, or Surrealism, we then demand an entirely different standard. And by our intellectual control of our own emotions, we declare things to be different from what they really are. In the Orient, of course, the problem of sight has become closely involved in art. And we know, for example, that in Chinese painting, a number of factors are developed which are strange to us. This type of art, of course, finally drifted into Korea and Japan so that it forms a comparatively solid Oriental bloc. We even find the same type of artistry in Burma, Siam, and other nearby regions. One of the difficult things, for example, in Oriental art, is the tendency of the artist to make his objects float in space. In other words, people walk on air, not on ground. The central image is placed clearly, but the background is completely eliminated. Thus, against a perfectly blank background, almost any kind of action can be implied. A procession can be walking along through the center of a blank sheet of paper, or a mountain will rise out of a blank, or disappear into it again. There is, in this case, no foreground and no background. Or perhaps the artist, being a little more inclined to establish a certain tone or concept for his painting, may supply a background consisting of a single rock, the rock itself floating in space, but having some relationship to other objects. The reason for this, apparently, was the ancient belief, psychologically, that we can only see a very limited area at a time. That if, for instance, in real life, we are looking at a person, we are unaware at that instant of the sidewalk on which he walks, we are unaware of the houses behind him, we are unaware of some other motion occurring in another part of the general visual field. We have limited ourselves upon the person, and in that moment of sight, the backgrounds are non-existent. We can immediately recall them, we can think about them, shift the point of view from the person to the background, and in that instant lose sight of the central image. But we have certain limited perspective. And in Oriental art, this is regarded as so valid that it is actually used in the depiction of things. Another interesting attitude which these people have is the surface type of painting with which they are so adroit. They do not usually use shadows. Nor do they make any effort to indicate that the body is three-dimensional. It is drawn on a two-dimensional surface. The artist says, this is what I have to work with. Why should I fake something else? Yet in European art, we have had a tendency to attempt to take a two-dimensional surface and create a three-dimensional picture. In many instances, we have done this so cleverly, so skillfully, and so wonderfully that a framed picture may look like an open window into a great world beyond. But the Oriental mind says that this is deceit. It isn't really true. Therefore, why do it? Also, bodies are shadows. The body of the person is a shadow. If that be true, then why make another shadow so that our drawing then has a shadow with a shadow of a shadow? He prefers, the Oriental artist, to recognize an entirely different type of value. He does the same with perspective. Whereas we allow perspective to converge at a distance, the Asiatic artist causes perspective usually to converge in the foreground. Therefore, a table in perspective, instead of growing smaller as it departs from the foreground, appears to grow larger. And nearly all forms, buildings, and everything of this nature are thus distorted, a very difficult thing for our Western minds to comprehend. But the Eastern artist is not interested in what we call realism, although for the most part he has never become a surrealist. What he is attempting to point out is that distance does not make things smaller. It may only appear to do so. This is a trick of sight. This is a part of the perspective with which our faculties endow our thinking. Actually, things remote may be far larger than things close to us. Philosophically, this immediately goes into an abstract concept. To the average person, his immediate individual existence is his foreground. Things which are not immediately concerned with him drift into his background. This background in Western art becomes less and less important, receding, until a man in the foreground is many times greater in size than a tree in the background. The Oriental shakes his head rather sadly at this type of thinking. He says, no, the tree in the background is, in its proper relationship to the man, is larger. It is only an optical experience which makes it seem otherwise. But to carry this into its philosophical level of contemplation, actually, those things which are remote, particularly remote in quality, should not be regarded as gradually disappearing into a three-dimensional perspective. What is more remote from man than truth, and what is greater? What is more remote from heaven than earth, or from earth than heaven? Yet actually, no matter how near earth may be, heaven is always greater. The values of things which seem remote to our consciousness at any given time are the really great things, the big things. Consequently, it is not wise for man to emphasize foreground and sacrifice background. For while man may seem great to himself, in nature he is merely an incident. The background is by far the greater. Therefore, if he does use images in distance, he will usually not convey them as we do, but will try to convey them in terms of their own importance, regardless of our perspective. He is working on a very subtle psychological point, which we come upon in another way, but which we cannot actually deny. And this subtle point, of course, is that through the power of sight, man has become tremendously focused upon immediacy. He has become overly aware of that which is proximately near, and has become unaware, or has come to neglect, that which is actually greater or more valuable. Thus in drawing pictures of people, we usually make them appear large and nature small, whereas in truth all people are small and nature is large. To become aware of this subconsciously has a certain therapeutic effect upon our tendency to extra egoism. It gives us a certain betterness of relationship with life around us. So in the use of sight, in our daily experiencing, we have to be rather careful and mindful of the operation of this faculty. We must gradually learn, if we possibly can, that the most that sight can actually reveal to us is the body of things. All sight, therefore, opens us into a world of symbols, not into a world of actual realities. The motions, characters, and attributes of persons, their clothing, their stylization, all these things are symbols. We see these symbols, but we do not see the person. We see a group as though actors in various impersonations, costumed and playing parts. But the actor behind the role we cannot see. And because of this, we have to continuously mellow the power of sight with judgment. We must become inwardly attentive of value, or else we mistake things seen for things real, coming to a series of conclusions that are essentially false and therefore philosophically unreasonable. We, for example, see with our eyes the human being passing through infancy, childhood, maturity, and age. We see the body passing through changes. If we are content to allow ourselves to assume that this appearance that we see, with its modifications, is the real person, then we immediately drift toward an extreme materialism. If we are allowed to assume that the physical achievements of man are sufficiently great so that we shall lose sight of the values which may be sacrificed for these achievements, then sight is playing us an ill trick. Thus it may well be that we stand as the ancients did in the presence of their princes, who were greatly adorned and richly vestured, and because our eyes beheld so much splendor, we bowed our knee to an individual who was as fallible as ourselves, as subject to all infirmities as ourselves, and perhaps in no way beyond us or above us in character, in understanding, or insight. Yet because he bore symbols of authority, we accept him as a symbol of authority. The eyes, consequently, can become a dangerous source of deceit to us. They can show us things, make us believe them, and then permit us to misdirect our conduct because we have built a philosophy upon sight and not upon meaning. Plato and many of the Greeks and other philosophers of the Mediterranean and Arabian areas developed interesting concepts as to how the faculty of sight operates. Not having our knowledge of certain operations of natural energy, these people were convinced that the power to see depended upon some kind of an energy which extended from the eye like a beam or ray. That this energy caused things around us to become illumined with visual energy and thereby visible to us. They held, therefore, that the sight faculty consisted of an individual turning a powerful spotlight through the eyes upon an object, that it was the light from the eye that lit the object. Later, however, many changes and modifications were made in this doctrine. One modification was to realize that the eye might see because it was able to receive visual images into itself, but that this beam of comprehension, this ray of intellectual light, had to also exist. Something had to go from the person to envelop the object. It was no longer the visual energy that went, it was the comprehending energy. Now this comprehending energy actually did not pour out of the eye in the form of tiny molecules or something of that nature. This comprehending energy, to a degree, existed in the brain itself. It was this comprehending energy, however, which gradually made things seem comprehensible. And without this power of understanding, seeing itself was comparatively meaningless. Thus, in order to see correctly, the individual must train not the eye alone, but the mind. And it is the degree of mental insight that is attained that determines the validity of the physical sight faculty. This psychologically makes good sense even now, and we are more and more convinced that this process of seeing is actually a highly neglected faculty. Like all our other sensory perceptions, we use them because we have them. We use them because they seem to unfold with us in the process of growth. We see things, everyone else sees things, and that's that. It never occurs to us that any of these faculties require special cultivation. Yet throughout the philosophic world, perhaps more in the past than in the present, it was clearly understood that every faculty had to be separately educated. That the process of educating a faculty was the same thing as the process of training an employee. If you train your agent well, he will conduct your business well. If, however, you do not train him and leave him to his own resources, perhaps he will not be very useful. Now, how do we train faculties? How do we strengthen the power to use sensory perceptions more wisely, more efficiently, and to achieve better internal cognition? Each faculty is subject to a series of disciplines. By these disciplines, the faculty becomes not merely an instrument of itself for the recording of its own impressions. It becomes an instrument of the person, by which he becomes more and more intelligently aware of the world in which he lives. All faculties can be trained. The most simple and most common faculty upon which training can be exercised is the faculty of feeling itself. We reach out and touch something. The testimony of this touching can be very, very complicated or very simple. A person perhaps who has been deprived of other senses, as for example a blind person, becomes extremely sensitive in the power of touch. He realizes that it is possible for him to unfold this faculty until it becomes far more useful to him than it would be if he still had his sight. But whether he has sight or not, the unfoldment of this faculty is possible. And with this unfoldment, there are mental and emotional reactions which are very important to the individual. We know that this is a subconscious happening in the lives of many people. The average person shopping, particularly women, will seldom if ever buy an object which they do not touch. They want to feel the material. They want to know that their sight is being supported by another faculty. And they can so easily be deceived by appearances that they insist upon this additional testimony. Yet in the common occurrences of life, we do not insist upon any further testimony. If we like the appearance of a person, we make no effort to justify our like or dislike by use of any other faculty perceptions. We simply accept that person. But an individual who will accept 100 people with sight alone will not buy a yard of goods on that basis. And perhaps the reason is that in this expenditure of money, in this determination to purchase something, a peculiar kind of self-interest comes in, and the individual is resolved to protect the validity of his investment. But whereas we live with people and around people, we do not sense this need to justify, to prove, or to demonstrate the validity of any of the things that we do. Also, we know that all faculties and sensory perceptions can be increased in accuracy in a way of protecting us from danger, hazard, or emergency of one kind or another. The individual who tastes polluted food receives a strong warning from this faculty of taste. Otherwise, he might possibly be poisoned. If, however, this food is highly disguised with condiments, or he is unfamiliar with the nature of the taste, he may allow himself to be made ill because he has not adequately estimated the importance of the taste testimony. We have the same thing with sight, of course. If it wasn't for sight, we would be unable to navigate in the world of rapid transportation. Yet we have to have also other faculties to come in and cooperate and coordinate sight testimony, or we can still be in difficulty. We also have to recognize the importance of our ability to sense odors of various kinds. These can be very valuable testimonies in daily life. One thing that is noticeable in Western culture especially is that gradually we have become so centered upon the faculty of sight that we have gradually lost the ability to keenly make use of other faculties. We know that many primitive peoples have a much better faculty adjustment than we have. We have intensely specialized. In the course of specialization, we have certainly worked a hardship upon our own balanced sensory program. It is assumed that where the proper testimonies exist, all of the sensory faculties should bring in their verdicts before the mind comes to a conclusion on anything. Such is not generally the case, however, in actual practice. We nearly always allow one faculty to dominate all the others in the interpretation of testimony. We have developed arts of various kinds, which particularly use certain faculties. And we know, for example, that in the case of music, the faculty of hearing is of special value to us. It is also true, however, that this faculty is very seldom perfect. And the musician particularly becomes keenly aware of his own defects of hearing. There are some persons who cannot hear correctly. They hear within a certain common range, but outside of this range their hearing is inadequate. And in the hearing range there is nearly always one dead spot. This is particularly annoying to violinists, who, because of the peculiar nature of their musical art, depend very heavily upon perfect hearing in the tuning of an instrument and in the determination of the full or clear tone which they wish to strike. Nearly all violinists, however, are tone deaf in one note, and this becomes something that has to be carefully worked out in an effort to maintain the proper harmony on their instruments. So all these remind us of the breaks in the sensory range. Now there is also a tendency, as we go along through years, for those faculties which are most specialized to gain a certain strength, and also we gain a continuing increasing dependency upon the faculties which we most use. As a result of this process operating subconsciously and subjectively, we have to know that faculties, by their specialization, influence character, influence our ability to meet problems every day, influence our taste and our judgment, and our reaction to the stimuli of common occurrences. We also realize that in every one of these faculties, as in sight itself, we are limited by a gamut or area in which the faculty operates. Outside of this, we are not aware of this particular faculty function. Thus, in radio and television today, we know the air around us is continuously filled with vibration, which, however, we do not pick up under normal conditions. I knew one very interesting case, however, of an individual who continuously picked up certain radio programs on his dentures. This is a rather unusual case, however, and cannot be depended on. Others have had programs and wireless messages come in on bed springs. But all in all, this world of vibration around us is closed to us. Not because it does not exist, not because it is not just as real as any world in which we do have sensory function, but simply because it is blocked out as far as we are concerned. And we are creatures living within a restricted sensory range. And this restricted range has very much to do with how we have evolved, why we are the kind of human being that we are, how our bodies, faculties, and powers have developed. All these are affected strongly by the sensory band which we possess. Now we also recognize that nearly all of the faculties can have two kinds of testimonies. One we may call conscious. This is the type of testimony that is communicated to the mental coordinator and becomes the basis of our instantaneous judgment about things contacted by the sense perceptions. We also, however, realize that there are a great many sensory testimonies that are accepted, do come into our subconscious natures, do affect us gradually, or do appear at some future time unexpectedly, about which we have no immediate conscious knowledge. Thus, faculty testimony comes in on a level of consciousness and on a level of subconsciousness. This level of consciousness is nearly always where the focal awareness is. The level of subconsciousness is where such focal point does not exist, and therefore the impact is general and unconditioned. Now, the individual cannot accept an unconditioned impact upon a conditioned nature. Consequently, the conditioned part of the impact he accepts. The unconditioned part slips through into the unconditioned subjective of himself, which it in turn proceeds to condition in one way or another, but not so obviously as on the objective level of living. Out of this problem, then, we have a great many different factors to consider. The poets of old used to refer to the eyes as the windows of the soul. They realized or believed that in some way the eyes were closer to the psychic center of consciousness than any other faculty that we possessed. They also made a great deal in their writings and their discussions of the appearances of eyes. That eyes could look very wistful or very sad or very nostalgic or very fierce, that there were eyes that seemed to shine with ambition and others that had the wonderful mystical placidity of some deep religious conviction. Actually, if we study the structure of the eye, we realize that this poetic discussion has very little foundation in fact. Actually, the human eye, it has no expression. It has actually no light of hope in it, nor any glint of desolation. It is no more expressive, actually, than the headlight on an automobile. But what happens is that the eye, by virtue of its records, by the mysterious nervous processes which associate with it, has extraordinary influence upon the structure and activity of the flesh around the eye. The nerve impulses from our reactions to feelings and things of that nature are especially subtle in the human face. There is no part of the body which can be more immediately expressive. Therefore, what we call a kindly eye is a structure around the eye, not the eye itself. The look of hate is not the actual eye, but the effect of the intensity of the emotions upon the structure of the face near and proximate to the eye. Also, in each individual, the eye is set somewhat differently, although the differences may be very minor. We have the deep set eye, and we have the eye that is close to the surface. We have many different racial types of eyes. I don't refer necessarily to color, although the color of the eye differs. The actual fact is that the placement of the eye in the head gives certain impression. And this placement belongs under the general study of physiognomy, in which we know that character and disposition do reveal themselves through the architecture of the face, and that part of the architecture which seemingly is most immediately called to our attention is that around the eye. For we have come ourselves to focus our attention upon the eyes of other people. Perhaps originally we did this for the same reason that animals did, because the eye shines or is bright or is a center which seems to suggest a polished gem or something which immediately calls or focuses attention. So we cannot say that the eye is actually able to convey a direct message. It is a lens, it is a structure. But every message that is brought by the eye into the brain reacts upon our total nature, giving us different attitudes and different reflexes and reactions. The eye is not filled with horror at the sight of something horrible, but the whole face becomes convulsed with the horror of the thing seen. And because this convulsion of horror centers around the delicate structure of the face near the eyes, we have the impression that it is the eye itself. Thus the eye is set in an elaborate setting, but its own function is limited to its one and inevitable purpose, namely to record, to report the condition of the world around to that being which, seated within the self, depends upon the sensory bridges for its contact with the external world. Now we have mentioned the importance of disciplining faculty perceptions. And as we know, we have to train the ear in order that it shall bear witness correctly to certain tones. We have to train the sense of feeling if we wish to be able to recognize certain fabrics and materials, objects and surfaces with which we come in physical contact. We have to train the sense of taste. Perhaps a good example of that is the tea taster, the individual who must grade teas, or the old-fashioned European wine taster, who must determine the correctness and propriety of certain vintages. In each case, great skill is developed until the sense of taste becomes an instrument of almost universal cognition. We also know that the other faculties have their various values to us. Without the sense of smell, the perfumer would be unable to admixture his compounds correctly. Every faculty is useful, and around each one of them trades have sprung up, and professions, crafts, and various specializations in which the individual with highly skillful faculties prepares commodities to be especially appreciated by these same faculties in other people. Thus the connoisseur, the expert, is one who has trained his faculties in a field or area, and is therefore capable of expertness within that area. Now, we are not here, most of us, at this time to become tea tasters or something of this nature, but we still do have the need for faculty discrimination and development. We have great need, for example, to train the faculty of hearing. We find, of course, that we can give ourselves a little instinctive lesson in this if we're much interested. We will observe that when someone says something nice about us, we hear it distinctly. When they criticize us, we don't hear it nearly as clearly. Or if we are psychoneurotic, we hear only the criticism, and seldom, if ever, arrive at the meaning for it. This brings out the fact that any testimony that comes through any faculty must some way be interpreted in terms of meaning. And meaning cannot usually arise from the faculty testimony itself, only upon judgment based upon it. Therefore, things seen are not solutional. But if we can think about the meaning of things seen, then sight becomes an instrument of personal growth. If we therefore wish to take full advantage of any faculty, we have to discipline its own clarity and its own intensity, and we must also strive for a coordination of faculties with the mental processes by which facts are sifted out of fancy and arranged for our contemplation. Now, there are two ways in which faculties can be disciplined. In the West, we always think of discipline as something in which we start out with a dictatorial attitude toward something or other. To us, discipline means getting in there and punishing something into a state of virtue. We think of discipline as inhibition, as restriction, as limitation. We think of discipline as standing the small boy in the corner and making him stand there till he gets over it. We think of discipline as the rod, which must not be spared. This type of thing causes us to think of the disciplining of faculties as a resolute determination to make these faculties operate. More accurately, more wisely perhaps, but certainly to civilize them into a state of usefulness. This can be done, but for most persons, the type of discipline that is necessary is not attractive. Discipline has a tendency to require a continuous effort, not indefinitely, but too long an effort for the average individual in the West to be willing to undertake. He does not wish to be sight conscious for 2 or 3 years in order to train his sight. He does not want to become hyper-attentive to hearing for a long period of time until he really learns how to hear correctly. Also, we all realize that sometimes parents punish children for the same crimes they themselves commit. Therefore, when we try to discipline a faculty, and we say now, take attention of this, keep on the job, report honestly, do not allow your attention to waver or drift away, do this right and continue to do it right. We are asking the eye, for example, to perform a function that the composite personality has never attempted to perform. We are asking the eye or the ear to become a highly disciplined faculty in a totally undisciplined constitution. We have never really thought in terms of disciplining even the mental coordinator that must pass judgment upon the testimony of the faculties. So if we get the faculty thoroughly trained and then dump its accurate testimony into an untrained mind full of prejudices, the power of the faculty is lost anyway. If the Oriental viewpoint on the matter is taken into consideration, however, we come to a somewhat different point of view, and one which I think has a great deal in favor of it, because it is the only approach to discipline that I have ever been able to find in philosophic literature that could be reasonably attractive. Certainly discipline is necessary, but how to get it? How to work out a pattern that will be followed by average persons who simply have not the stamina nor the intention to subject themselves to a long and trying experience in self-improvement regardless of the rewards. So in your Eastern thinking, you have an entirely different point of view. The point of view there is that the faculties of themselves are normal, always have been and always will be. That the difficulty is not that the faculties fail us, but rather that we fail them. Consequently, our trouble is not that the eyes do not record adequately. The trouble is that we do not use the record properly. The only way, then, that any faculty can be relieved of its tendency to misrepresent, not because the faculty itself misrepresents, but because the complex of processes results in a misrepresentation. The best way to solve this is simply relax. If we do not try to indoctrinate the faculties themselves, they will not misrepresent themselves. If we have an open mind, in other words, if we are honest ourselves, our faculties will report honestly. They always have. But we have destroyed this honesty with our own dishonest thinking. If we have ulterior motives constantly moving in ourselves, the things we see, hear, taste, touch will always have these ulterior factors as elements in interpretation. If we are naturally jealous, the success that we see come to other people will make us unhappy rather than happy. If we are envious of what some other person has, we will be unhappy when we see this possession that we wish was ours. Thus, the faculties become disturbed or perverted by the coordinator, not by their own testimony. If we would relax to these problems and accept testimonies as they are, we would then gradually come to live in a universe that is more and more obviously real. The moment we are willing to accept reality, this reality is available. It comes into us through these faculties. It is not absolute reality, inasmuch as the reality of things within faculty perception cannot be absolute. But what we do see or hear, we will receive or cognize factually. We will know that the thing is itself. And if we will not build all kinds of exaggerations around these testimonies, we can live with them substantially and honorably. Thus, to have the true power of sight depends always upon this cultivation of internal sight or insight. Actually, our faculty carries records to these coordinating powers, and the coordinators must use them. If we do not know how to use the testimonies of the senses, we will most certainly abuse these testimonies. If we do not have a normal reaction to certain conditions, we will gradually develop artificial tastes, artificial attitudes. One simple example of this is in the very problem of food itself. Man, by nature, left undisturbed by his own attitudes, will find that he has a natural appetite for natural foods naturally prepared. He will find that good foods suitable to his needs have their own flavors, that these flavors are truly delightful, that they are appreciated, that they, by their very flavorability, become more easily digestible. For our reaction to food has much to do with how the system will later use that food. And an individual who sits down to a meal that is utterly uninteresting is not going to have good digestion. But the natural foods, the natural products, well prepared, naturally prepared, are attractive. But man has gradually lost sight of this, and he has now come to a point where he resents the fact that any food tastes like itself. He has to do something about this immediately. If he is out at the barbecue and has barbecued something, he is not going to allow that to taste the way it is when reasonably cooked. He is going to put barbecue sauce on it, which is going to make it taste like a combination of creosote and ketchup. And almost any food that he eats is going to taste like this. He has learned to like this. He has learned to like condiments of all kinds. The tendency of condiment being to conceal the original taste of the food. Later, if he does not dump pepper and all kinds of condiments upon the food, it is not attractive to him. He has lost the power to taste the natural foods of life as they come. Many condiments are harmless, if rather disconcerting to the faculty perceptions. But some of them are dangerous. Some of them are unhealthful. Some of them impair health. Man, however, now feels that he has to stimulate the sense of taste by condiment. As a result, everything tastes different from what it is, and he forgets the fact that his great ancestors of one kind or another simply used condiments because they lacked refrigeration. You had no way of keeping food, so it spoiled. So you didn't want to throw it away. So you put something in it to cover the taste of spoilage. Then you tried to eat it and let nature fight it out down below. This was the secret of condiments. But we have passed by that, but not by the condiment. Now we can do the same thing with the eyes. We can subject the eyes to all kinds of visual condiments, all kinds of artificialities. We can take a room in which we live and make it an eyesore to our souls. We can load it with things so that the eyes must continuously be confronted with confusion. If the eye becomes finally completely exhausted by the confusion, it sends a quick message to the brain and says, I give up. The whole thing is hopeless. Not only is the thing I'm looking at not attractive, it is meaningless, and before I have a chance to see it, my owner moves my faculty to something else, and there is no clear impression of anything. So the eyes, confronted by a series of artificial and meaningless conglomerates, get into trouble. Also, we sometimes wonder why we don't enjoy clashing colors, and why we are rather seriously inclined to subjectively work for some kind of color harmony. Actually, it is not because that particular shade of purple doesn't seem to go very well with that particular shade of pink. It is that we are dealing constantly with vibration. All colors are vibratory. We record them not as color, but as rate of vibration that must be again reassembled in the mind or brain to become the color that we saw on the outside. If we throw a group of discordant vibrations into this common reservoir, these vibrations afflict each other. If they are inharmonious, they fight, completely apart from the visual fight that we see is a vibratory fight. This vibratory fight causes uneasiness. This uneasiness we interpret as something we don't like very well. We therefore take the picture down and put it somewhere else. We can't endure it in that spot any longer. But this is due to a struggle arising within consciousness. Now, the final purpose of all sensory perception is not its own glorification, but that it shall perform a useful function. To be truly useful, therefore, the eyes and all other faculties must contribute something to the maturing and development of the conscious being within the body. It cannot be simply a process of continuous eye-fullness for no purpose. To make this adjustment by which things become meaningful, you have to go back a little into the Pythagorean theory and those attitudes held by the ancient Egyptians, and realize that all sensory perceptions constitute ways of reaching the inside from the outside. That in some way each sensory perception is like a little wire that can carry a message. And it becomes very important what kind of a message we entrust to it. Because this message, in its ultimate, will affect or condition character. It will make the individual a better or a poorer person in terms of value. Sight and hearing are especially prominent in this particular area, for it is through hearing that instruction reaches the mind. It is through hearing that music reaches the consciousness. And many people feel that as far as educational value is concerned, it is quite a question as to whether hearing or sight may be regarded as the most valid instrument. But in any event, through hearing, we take in knowledge. Through hearing, however, we also take in prejudice. We take in all kinds of false opinions or attitudes. Through hearing, we also take in dissonances of various kinds, which are very difficult for our nervous systems and can afflict us. If we are in the presence of certain discordant sounds long enough, they will make us sick. Thus, through these faculty perceptions, the inner life of the body is made more comfortable or uncomfortable. The things that we receive through the senses affect and modify our own natures. At the moment, we are especially interested in the terms of sight. Therefore, we can think now of sight as a factor in psychological adjustment to life. Actually, man, in order to be happy physically and objectively in this world, must be adjusted with the essential values of life. He must learn to discriminate between the appearance and the substance of things. He must also learn to know the difference between that which is natural and that which is not natural. Largely speaking, man lives in a twofold world as far as his sight faculties are concerned. He lives in a world of nature and a world which he himself has built. In the mountains, in the desert, in the broad plains, he lives with nature. In the city, he lives with the products of his own ingenuity. Very largely today, man's cultural development is associated with urban living. He may very graciously depart into a suburb, but he does not get very far away. Actually, today, the average person lives largely under the constant influence of man-made things. He lives in an environment which is man-fashioned. He lives in a house which is man-built. He lives with commodities which man has devised. He lives with luxuries which man has invented. In his daily laboring and working, he works with people on human projects. And little by little, these human projects, whether they be at the desk or in the church on Sunday, these projects take over. He becomes more and more involved in the man-made existence. He hears it. Today, in almost any metropolitan community, there is no such thing as silence. There is simply a mental indifference to a certain type of sound. We become accustomed to these sounds and we do not hear them. In fact, we may suddenly hear the absence of them. An individual living constantly in a certain sound sleeps beautifully. If the sound stops in the middle of the night, he wakes up. He is able, therefore, subconsciously to note that silence is a complete change in his experience of sound reception. Realizing that man lives in this completely artificial world, it is obvious that his sensory perceptions must convey in that which they receive. The Chinese hermit, deciding to live a holy life, or perhaps merely desiring a little more happiness than most commonly is to be found, joins a number of his others in the bamboo grove, and they live in a retirement back with nature. He builds a little hermitage by the side of a waterfall. He finds the music of the waterfall always charming to him. He lives in the voice of the winds. He sees nature unfolding. He beholds the regular procession of the seasons, and he is at peace with himself and the world. This type of experience has a certain health in it, because this person is now seeing nature. And in seeing nature, he sees a little more than merely things. He sees natural procedure. He senses this flowing path of Tao through space. He is one with the rhythms of life. He sees these rhythms unfold through the seasons and through the alternations of night and day. He lives on simple food. He keeps simple cycles of sleeping and waking. He has lost those tremendous ambitions which held him to the world. He is quiet. He can become a poet. He can paint a beautiful picture. He can learn to play great music, or he can simply be still and let the music of the universe flow through him. This is a utopian type of thing which for the most part would bore the Westerner to distraction. He'd be all right for the first 15 minutes, and then he would simply perish for lack of a good locomotive whistle. We have an entirely different approach to these matters, but it does not follow that our approach is right. But when we do surround ourselves entirely with the products of our own ingenuity, it is very much like surrounding ourselves with a group of babbling people, all talking about something else, no two agreeing on anything, and no two perhaps with any basic insight in common. When a group of people get together and they all talk at once, we call it a social success. If they keep quiet, we say it's a total failure. There's only one thing left in order to bring a note of success to the occasion, and that is that everyone shall become intoxicated. Then they will continue to babble. And we will babble with them, and no one will care, and no one will know, but no one seems to worry about it. Because we have lost the faculty to discriminate about the very nonsense that is going on. In this way, architecture is the same. We live in a city. Different architects build different buildings and stand them side by side, and there is no pattern, rhyme, or reason in anything. The wholesale furniture manufacturer manufactures a mass of different styles. People buy them, or they simply rent the thing in a furnished apartment, and then they sit down and try to live with a taste that is not only not their own, but from some of these accumulations doesn't seem to have belonged to anyone. Thus, we live in this confusion. Our eyes take it in. Our eyes find no harmony, no symmetry, no order, and very little beauty. Once in a great while, the tired eyes may hit upon some charming object and have a moment of great rest and joy. But for the most part, they see only the confusion of man-made uncertainties. They see the immaturity of human taste constantly reflected back from everything that we do. Out of this, as Pythagoras pointed out, you can get very, very sick. And one way in which the troubles of a generation communicate themselves to the next generation is through these monuments which must be assimilated by the sensory perceptions. We must take these things in. We must live with them until perhaps finally we rebel against them, or becoming exhausted, fall into them as into some deep quagmire and there expire. Thus, the eyes, by taking in these things which are not so, not true, not right, not beautiful, which have in them no evidence of the great motions of space, which find in themselves no evidence of Tao, no evidence of the great harmonies of things, these eyes carry nothing but irritation into the subjective. It is not to be surprised at, therefore, that sometimes we get rather antisocial. We get tired of the whole thing. We truly do wish that we might be on a desert island somewhere and escape from all this ultimate and continuous pressure. If we worry about the smog interfering with respiration, we should realize that the chaos around us is a kind of psychic smog which irritates all of our sensory perceptions and destroys our power to enjoy or to appreciate or to relax. The Greeks were very definite about this. They felt very definitely that no generation could outlive the abnormalcies of its own environment. That the quickest way to destroy a people, to bring down a civilization, or to wreck a generation, was to allow that which is poor, bad, inadequate, inconsistent, to exist in the environment around us. Therefore, they prescribed the architecture of their communities, that it be harmonious. They told what men could write in poetry and music, and if men wrote contrary to harmony, they were not permitted to publish their works. They taught what the individual could do to advance and mature his own culture. They taught the importance of gardens and beauty, the importance of keeping the air clear and bright, and to have everywhere pleasant and joyous monuments to the convictions which they regarded as important. So out of all of this came the classic emphasis upon art. Art that was to be brought into the most commonplace of life. Art that was to be brought into the spoon and the dish and the bowl. Art that said that even the most common things that we use must be beautiful. And that the home, the house, no matter how simple, must either have the greatness of great art or the dignity of great simplicity. That these things are right, and that we cannot be right unless we do something about them. Now we know that beauty is not carried into us through all the sensory perceptions, but it certainly is carried in through sight. That to constantly confront the individual with good taste is to influence and mature his inner life. That therefore the importance of religion in art, which was anciently accepted and has now been generally ignored, is a real one. Also that in religious art, which we are going to see, a great deal of importance is derived from the nature of the subject matter, the type of picture with which we become familiar. I don't think there's any doubt in the world that one of the greatest handicaps that Christianity has ever had to face has been its melancholy art. We have long assumed that religious art must be sad, must be something unworldly, something that suggests that man is a sinner and that he's got to get over it the long, hard way. This type of art, the art of sacrifice, of martyrdom, of pain, and of suffering, absolutely incomprehensible to non-Christian people, has, I think, been a great burden upon us. I think we should do much more to make religious art in the West truly great art. We should think also of religious art as something which lifts up the soul into a new level, not a level of sympathy or compassion alone, but a level of sublimity, a level by which the person comes to realize more and more the magnificence of the world. If we can get more of the positive into it, we may be able to gradually remove some of the negative factors. And these negative factors, taken in constantly through the sensory perceptions, do have an effect upon us. They have an effect upon everything that we think and feel. Somewhere in the long background of things, man sort of declared war on nature. He decided he wasn't going to allow nature to dominate his life. He was going to conquer nature. He went out, therefore, to tear the world apart, so to say, and has ended up by being torn apart himself. Instead of making nature the great thing, and his own way of art, beauty, and culture a gracious acceptance of nature, he has tried continuously to competitively outdo nature. He has taken nature and artificially adapted it to his purposes, rather than to adapt himself to the eternal purposes of nature itself. This is obvious in so many things that we do, and it results in a kind of arrogance, and it also sets us into a battle against the very realities that we most desperately need. That's why I've always had great admiration for Oriental housing, where the little house is not there to try to be a status symbol. The individual doesn't have to worry as to whether his neighbor's house is bigger than his or not. If he gets enough of that kind of worry, he will ultimately have no home such as he thinks of now, but will end up in that conventional 3-by-6-foot house, which is the final habitation of us all. He has competed to create a house. He puts the house up on a point somewhere so that it will look as though he is Lord of all he surveys. He will make it as powerful and important appearing as he can. If it will look like a palace or a chateau, then he has status. It is all utterly contrary to nature. He has lost all of the beauty of nature. All he can do is sit back and regard with unending admiration the accomplishment of a mediocre architect. He has no longer any consciousness of the great architect who has fashioned all these things. Yet if he sets his house gently against a background of nature, if he makes it disappear into nature, if it is a gracious thing that is never obtrusive, if it is something of comfort which carries with it the kindliness of the great trees, which sets back gently into the meadows and the fields, so that we see mostly a garden and only a very little house, then perhaps we are beginning to live back again with nature. Our house now is our homage. It is our offering to nature. We have colored it to match nature's desire. We have not developed one of these beautiful bird egg blue values in an environment where it doesn't belong. Nor have we tried to set a fine old colonial manse out in the midst of a cactus desert somewhere. We have fitted these things as the American Indian did, his adobe into the very soil which was his world. These things left nature comparatively undisturbed. And man, looking out across his world, saw not first the achievements of other men, but the sky and the mountains and the rivers and the great forests, which were his natural home. To see these things and to see them consistently is very, very good. The old Zen masters point out that nature is forever painting pictures. Nature is forever sculpturing forms. And if you will let a garden run into your house a little bit somewhere, a tiny living thing will make a great sculpturing for you out of its own tiny seed. It will grow and develop into a painting or into a sculpturing that no human being can actually equal. So to get more and more of this type of thing is to have truly the eyes in the presence of things, the seeing of which is good. It will cause the person constantly to see value, to see something that carries into his own heart and life a message of peace. Peace can come through the eyes to a very large degree, but only when we give peace a chance to do so. Now, we cannot change the whole face of the world. We cannot prevent our neighbors from building as they please. We cannot alter all of these things. We must brace ourselves for certain shocks that are inevitable. But we can, in every way that we know how, neutralize these ills in those private regions over which we have some peculiar proprietorship. We can make our little square of earth as near as possible the symbol of our own adjustment with life. If we must have symbols, let us always bring out of ourselves those symbolic things which, when seen again through the eyes, bring back medicine into ourselves. It's the same way as though a person himself paints a picture. With his own skill and the best ability that he has, he captures through his eyes some scene. This scene he then places upon paper or canvas to the skill that he possesses. Then he looks at what he has done, and from the thing he sees, a message is taken back into his consciousness again. This consciousness now subconsciously records the degree of achievement that the person has expressed through his own artistry. This is why it is so important, if we can, to develop certain creativities of our own, so that we can supply this satisfaction of having the pleasurable, the valuable reaction to that which we have created through our own unfolding sense of artistry. In various forms of therapy today, we are recognizing more and more the therapeutic value of symbols which suggest order. We are working now, perhaps as never before in our Western life, for simplification. But simplification is not just the reduction of masses. Simplification is always the development of the natural laws in things. A tree is a very complicated thing, and yet a very simple one. Nature does not simplify by taking all the leaves off the tree. And man, trying to simplify, again breaks rules because he does not know any better. Simplification is harmony. It is the recognition of the dependency of parts upon wholeness. Simplification is therefore the discovery always of that unity which includes things, and yet permits them to have a life of their own. So in art, architecture, clothing, utilities, everything we know today, the real end, the real purpose, is to bring them into a constructive order, so that we can accept this order into ourselves constantly, and thereby become better ordered human beings. I think one of the problems that confronts young parents today is this problem of creating symbols of order for children, not permitting these children to live in the constant presence of disorder, but bring them into some kind of patterned existences, patterns that are accepted for the child first through the eyes and the ears and the hands, patterns that it opens its little eyes to when it comes into this world, patterns which it will therefore not depart from in its gray hairs. If a child is brought up with a certain fundamental appreciation of value through the first 5 or 6 years of life, its integrities in later years are very much better protected. In fact, if it is well brought up to the 7th year, the chances are 9 out of 10 that it will make the rest of the way itself. But to do this, there has to be some kind of pattern. The individual, seeing deformity or seeing asymmetry, is inwardly made nervous. His nervousness communicates outwardly, again disturbing his body. The disturbance of his body disturbs his sensory perceptions, and he begins to see in an ulterior manner, or listen in an ulterior manner. He is no longer able to accept things, or else he gives them false values, and out of false values increases his own disinterest, his own unhappiness. Little by little, bad habits creep into the whole sensory gamut, causing the person a great deal of trouble as he tries to go on through life. Let us then think in the terms of the eyes, particularly, that through these eyes we learn things. We learn first the nature of visibles around us. Also, we gradually learn the limit of visibles. We learn how far the visible can go and how far it cannot go. We gradually come to inwardly sense, as science does, that all visibles are suspended from invisible principles or causes which we cannot see. We discover that the sense of sight shows us neither the beginning nor the ends of things, but only a certain middle distance in which they appear and then fade from our apperception again. Thus, sight reveals that the visible universe is not sufficient. It reveals to us that it must be that this world is suspended from greater causes. Sight explains to us the limits, the boundaries, the uncertainties, the inevitables of the processes of things around us. There is probably no faculty that is more useful in discovering the immortality of the human soul than sight, and there is no use to which sight is so seldom put. Thus, sight, instead of showing us always the permanence of things, must also show us the motions of things, by which everything changes. Sight would release us all from nearly every fixation we possess, had we be skilled to use it wisely. If we could watch the changes of things and adjust to these changes, if we really believed in the motion of seasons and in the movements of tides, we would gradually achieve a sense of rhythm in ourselves and realize that we are part of motion rather than of objects alone. We also know that in sight we discover the meaning of interval. We discover the meaning that the artist has to discover of the placement of things. We realize that sight shows us constantly mathematical formulas of order in space, that these formulas are applicable to our own conduct. Sight is very wonderful. It is very useful. It is a very great and useful servant, but a terrible tyrant if we permit visibles to become the total measure of existence. We cannot live to adore the things seen, but we cannot reject these things. But through them we can come to understand those principles which make things visible. We can learn to realize that the life makes the flower to grow, that all these forms are beautiful, orderly, and visible, simply because of energy moving through structure, that out of the invisible dust of space there comes forth all things that men can see. Back to this invisible it returns again, All the things that we see have an impermanence and a departure into space. Thus, if we really use these faculties correctly, they help us to be philosophers, mystics, idealists, poets, and dreamers. But if we allow our attentions to merely focus upon some one small thing, if we say this thing is the great reality, then anything that is outside of ourselves and receives such attention leads to idolatry. Idolatry is nothing but the worship of the visible, whereas great art is nothing but the understanding of the visible. And as we understand the visible, we grow. As we worship it, we decline. But always the understanding of the visible includes the orientation of the visible in the midst of other things not seen. The appreciation of sound leads us ultimately to the comprehension of silence. The appreciation of color leads us ultimately to our adoration of the great colorless mystery, which is at the root of color. All things lead through the sensory perception to this altar of the unknown, and there is nothing that can cause us more quickly to fall to our knees in the worship of invisibles than this very power of sight, which is limited entirely to the consideration of visible things. So through the eyes we achieve much, and through them we gain a great advantage, a wonderful opportunity. What we do with that opportunity depends entirely upon ourselves. I'd like to announce at this time that our subject for next Sunday, we're going to take up some of the problems of diet and nutrition, ancient and modern attitudes about food and things of that nature, and we think we'll have some interesting matter for discussion. I'd like to also say that the PRS Center Study Group meets after the lecture today in the lecture room upstairs, where there will be a discussion of the subject of the morning. Bring all your sense perceptions and attend as a guest of the headquarters study group. I'd like to announce that our new little gift shop department, which we have opened in a kind of annex to the library annex, we now have a double annex, will be open after the lecture for friends who would like to look at the cards and gifts and things that we have. And in connection with the lecture of the morning, we have a little book on occult anatomy which contains matters of interest relating to these things, and you know that nearly all of our literature is concerned with this type of problem. The library will be open today only until 1 o'clock, which is about a half hour from now. That will enable persons who have not seen the Chinese and other Oriental book bindings and early Ming printings to have a look at those. And if there are any of you who have had art objects or anything laid aside, you can pick them up this morning. The library will be open long enough for that. It is not open as long as usual because there is a meeting of the PRS Friends Committee scheduled for 1 o'clock in one of the rooms of the building here. Those who are interested in attending this meeting, who are donors or workers or helpers, are invited to attend and help plan the activities of the coming season, including the special event which is now called the Thrift Sale, which is scheduled for July 22nd, 5 weeks from today. We're going to have some kind of an extraordinary occasion at that time to bring great joy to the optical equipment of everyone concerned. So we hope that you will be prepared for this event. Also, I want to thank you very much for the kind expression of some of the friends this morning who wished me a happy Father's Day. Well, that's very nice. I've never gotten any closer to it than stepchildren, but I sort of feel I have quite a large family of my own, and sometimes I really think that I have taken on a sort of collective fraternity. So I thank you very kindly for this kind remembrance, and to all of you who are celebrating Father's Day at this time, good celebration and the best of everything to you. We'll see you next week.